Good afternoon again, and a very warm welcome to all of you. We know that today, since the morning, the Global Young Leaders Dialogue, which was initiated by the Center for China and Globalization, is really a platform that's hoping to play a role in helping young people, regardless of country, of origin, or continent, to come together and think about how their unique expertise can be driven towards more impact-oriented careers. So this is in a nutshell what we're hoping to do. We've had the GYLD talk, we had 2 plenaries in the morning, and right now, Plenary 3, which is co-hosted between ICRC and CCG, co-hosted by the International Committee of the Red Cross, East Asia Office, and Center for China and Globalization, is aimed at understanding how the threat of climate change, the challenge that we face, can be dealt with in a better way. So the topic really, climate change and resilience, it's also about how we can think about communities that face the worst consequences of climate change, whose lifestyles are not contributing to the situation and reality that we are today experiencing. What can they do? How can they be more resilient against the awful impact of climate change? And I'll also mention that, the idea did come up. I'm from Pakistan, and I'm a fellow at the Center for China and Globalization soon, for those who have just joined us. And last year, around this time, my country faced one of the worst floods that I have ever known of, in the last 3 decades or so of my life. And it was really a question about what can those people in my country do to reduce the current trend of climate change. And that's where, the question of climate injustice comes into play. So today, we will try and help our young leaders understand what is the impact of climate change on communities that haven't contributed to the current crisis, especially. What can we as young people do to understand really how the climate change crisis manifests itself, and what is the impact in terms of food insecurity, in terms of safety, security, etc. And for that, it is really our pleasure to be joined also as keynote speaker by Lei Pili. Mr. Lei Pili is Deputy Director of the Global Development Promotion Center of the China International Development Cooperation Agency, or CITCA. And we are also very honored to be joined by Mr. Thierry Mehat, who is personal envoy of the President, head of the Regional Delegation, International Committee of the Red Cross. Let's warmly welcome. And we have 5 panelists, 2 from ICRC who will be joining us online, and 3 of our young leaders from different countries who will offer different perspectives on how we can tackle the climate challenge. So this is, in a nutshell, what today's conversation is going to be about. For more, you all have the concept note, the details. But without further ado, I would like to warmly welcome our first keynote speaker, Mr. Lei Pili. Please. Let's warmly welcome.
感谢民族研究员
I want to thank Madam Zung Ahmed. I want to thank the ICRC representative, Mr. Merat, Madam Miao Lu, Secretary General of CCG. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm so honored to be invited by CCG to attend this forum on behalf of the CITCA, Global Development Promotion Center, and on behalf of Director Tang Ying, to express congratulations to you on the hosting of the forum. Climate change is a serious challenge to the world today. It's related to the survival of mankind and a beautiful future of mankind. It is critical to the harmony between man and nature. The 19th Party Congress report said that man and nature should be a community of a shared future, and President Xi at the UN General Assembly officially launched the carbon goals for 2030 and 2060, that is to peak carbon emissions by 2030, and before 2060 we will achieve carbon neutrality. And we will add a strong impetus to the achievement of Paris Accord. And the 18th Party Congress said that to protect nature and follow the laws of nature is required by China's modernization. And the harmony between man and nature is also required in the Chinese-style modernization. It is also a show of responsibility of China as a major country in the world. When China is promoting its own development and green transition, we are committed to work under the framework of South-South cooperation to promote green development, international cooperation and exchanges in order to make a historical contribution to the historical progress. At the UN General Assembly, President Xi Jinping also launched the Global Development Initiative, taking green development and climate change as the part of priorities of international cooperation, which are also in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. That is also an impetus to the UN agenda, and it attracts much international attention and a positive response. And in this year, the CIDCA organized the first high-level meeting in Beijing. President Xi gave us a congratulatory message. Mr. Wang Yi read the message of President Xi Jinping and delivered a keynote speech. Representatives from over 150 countries and international organizations attended the forum, online and offline, altogether over 1,500 of them. They worked together to explore the pathways for future development. And during the event, we also held a sub-forum on green development. Hundreds of representatives attended the sub-forum, and expert scholars and ambassadors and industry leaders focused on climate change, energy revolution, technology, innovation, etc. And they reached a very good consensus. And they expressed their determination for green development and transition. And during the event, CIDCA also issued the financing rules for the Global Project Bank. Actually, that was a follow-up on President Xi's announcement a few years ago. CIDCA is a leading agency in this endeavor. The Global Development Project Bank is based on voluntarism and transparency and openness, and we focus on green development and transition and other priorities of global development, and we bring together global development resources to match the real needs of developing countries for development. So here, we also welcome all of you to be involved in the projects.
Ladies and gentlemen, the young people represent the future, and the global development calls for the involvement of the young people to promote sustainable and green development. Young friends are needed to deliver the global development initiative and to add more vigor and vitality into global development. The Global Development Promotion Center has initiated the home of global leaders, Song Qinglin Foundation, the World Economic Forum, and the Beijing Association of Entrepreneurs, all support this home. This home of global leaders was unveiled, and the Global Development Promotion Center will work with all stakeholders to focus on climate change and other global challenges and find solutions to these challenges and build the capacity for achieving the Sustainable Development Agenda. As another thing of China goes, a heavy weight is no longer difficult to lift as long as people all pitch in. The Global Development Promotion Center will work hard to deliver more public goods for the well-being of the people, and we will put people at the center, and we will build greater synergy between the GDI and the Sustainable Development Agenda. And people should benefit from a better environment. We need to urge developed countries to deepen South and North cooperation. We should also promote South-South cooperation for a better climate. We must enhance international cooperation on climate change response and biodiversity. We should bring into full play the role of civil society, NGOs, and all stakeholders to coordinate the efforts. We should also incubate green projects and deliver the global development pool and protect the environment. We will maximize the value of green products. We will incubate more products that can be conducive to green development. We will also deliver more livelihood projects so that people can benefit from development. Ladies and gentlemen, let us work together to deliver the GDI, to pursue low carbon and green development, and protect our common planet. In closing, I wish the forum a full success. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. David.
非常感谢雷霹雳主任。
Important for people with experience, especially representing organizations like Sitka, which is playing an integral role in improving the quality of lives of so many people. For you to encourage young people that are sitting here and beyond is very meaningful. And also, absolutely, to bridge the North-South divide, to help North-South cooperation and South-South cooperation. Climate change is one of those challenges that cannot be tackled without that. So thank you, appreciate. Next, it's an honor for us to warmly welcome Mr. Tehi Mehat, who is also our next keynote speaker, our co-host. And Mr. Tehi Mehat is the personal envoy of the President, Head of Regional Delegation, International Committee of the Red Cross, and has experience in various countries in the Global South and Global North. So before I invite Mr. Tehi Mehat for his keynote remarks, let's watch a video shared by his team. This might take a minute.
For many people in Mali, it's a race against time.
Ici, c'était une grande forêt. D'abord, c'était notre lac où nous cultivons. Avec la sécheresse aujourd'hui, c'était devenu une forêt. Après la forêt, c'est le gaz. Ce gaz-là est venu ronger tout ce qu'on a comme arbre ici. Le gaz a brûlé toute la terre. Ça, c'est quelque chose que les arbres, la terre a changé de couleur.
Roughly 2/3 of Mali is desert or semi-desert, exposed to climate-related hazards such as drought, floods, locust invasion. Since the 1980s, 28 major droughts have affected over 7 million people. Temperatures have increased by 0.7 degrees across most of the country, and little climate finance reaches those communities that need it most. Mali has also been racked by conflict since 2012. In the north, violence has resulted in death, displacement, and economic instability. Up to 2021, more than 300,000 people have been uprooted from their homes. Cattle herders fear attacks from armed groups, and tensions rise over scarce resources. Meanwhile, desertification advances.
Il y a une force plus forte que nous qui est venue d'évoluer. Vous voyez, cette dune de sable n'était pas là. 400 élèves, cela veut dire toute une génération perdue.
Let's welcome Mr. Tehi Mehad.
Thank you, Zoom. Good afternoon, everybody. I do think that the images that you just saw, they do speak for themselves. And I will, in my presentation, describe a bit what means the relation between climate change and conflicts. But allow me first to thank CCG for co-organizing this panel. For us, it's a great pleasure to work together and have this opportunity to deal with a very important subject, which is, as you know, related to climate change and conflict. Climate change and environmental degradation threaten the survival of humanity. All dimensions of our lives are affected, from our physical and mental health to our food, water, and economic security. While the crises are impacting everyone, those who have contributed least to the problem are hit hardest, and it is only getting worse. Countries enduring armed conflict and other violence, the vast majority of which are among the world's least developed countries, are some of the most vulnerable to the climate crisis. Afghanistan, Somalia, Mali, and Yemen, such countries are vulnerable to droughts, floods, insect plagues, and changing rainfall patterns. Unfortunately, the list can be very long. This makes it highly relevant to the ICRC, an organization of 160 years history, which is mandated by states to ensure humanitarian protection and assistance for victims of armed conflict and other situations of violence. These populations' capacity to adapt to a changing climate is drastically limited by the disruptive impact that wars have on societies. Their acute vulnerability and severe capacity constraints should, in theory, ensure that they are prioritized for climate action. In practice, countries in conflict are among those most neglected when it comes to climate action and finance. Climate change does not directly cause armed conflict, but that it may indirectly increase the risk of conflict by exacerbating factors that can, in a complex interplay, ultimately lead to conflict. Such factors include social exclusion, a history of conflict and grievances, economic risk, environmental degradation, and tensions over the management of resources. In peaceful environments with solid institutions that provide social protection, resolve tensions, manage the use and allocation of resources in a sustainable and equitable manner, and ensure inclusive development, climate change does not cause violent conflicts. Countries affected by conflict, violence, or fragility tend to suffer from the absence of strong governments and inclusive institutions. There, climate change may contribute to exacerbating and prolonging conflict and instability and aggravating communal violence by further weakening institutions, system, and people-calming mechanisms. In our work, we see that in the absence of institutions able to mediate tensions and manage resources equitably, climate risk and environmental degradations can fuel local tensions and instability and contribute to shaping dynamics of violence. This emerged clearly in the case studies that we conducted on the humanitarian consequences of converging climate risk and conflict in the Central African Republic, Mali, and Iraq. In the Central African Republic, people focused on the tensions between farmers and herders, resulting from changing patterns of transhumance and from the limited capacity of authorities to regulate internal and cross-border movements. For example, Iraqi flagged tensions and episodes of violence related to water sharing. In northern Mali, people spoke of internal tensions around access to resources. Adapted climate action in these locations is critical to reduce humanitarian needs, preserve development gains, and avoid systemic breakdown and lasting fragility. Major and urgent political efforts to mitigate climate change are critical to avert the most devastating consequences of the crisis on people and their environment. As an organization which observes on a daily basis these impacts by climate hazards on populations who are already vulnerable, the ICRC has been advocating and raising concerns at various platforms, such as the UN Security Council and in bilateral discussions with stakeholders. At the COP27 in Egypt in 2022, the ICRC was represented with leaders who shared views from a humanitarian perspective. The ICRC called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the governing bodies of the Conference of Parties to make 3 commitments to ensure that people living in conflict settings are not left behind. First, acknowledge the high vulnerability to climate risk of countries enduring conflict due to their limited adaptive capacity. Second, live up to international commitments to bolster climate action in countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate change, which entails strengthening climate action in countries enduring conflict and violence. Third, ensure that this action is adequately supported by fit-for-purpose and accessible climate finance. The ICRC has also adopted a set of organizational targets and a roadmap for their implementation, including factoring climate and environmental risk in all programs by 2025, and reducing ICRC greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by 2030, compared to 2018 levels, including all direct and indirect emissions. No one can address these challenges alone. We must work together across the humanitarian sector and beyond to strengthen climate action. We will continue to share this message with climate actors who are not present or have limited visibility into areas affected by armed conflicts. Today, I hope these elements can make an impact on you, the young talents from diverse backgrounds, students, international experts, and diplomats who have the interest and concern on this topic and have the willingness and capability to make change. The ICRC, as a humanitarian organization that seeks to alleviate suffering in situations of conflict, pushes for climate finance and action in communities affected by conflict and violence. We must collectively find solutions and ensure access to adequate finance in challenging environments. Leaving people behind is not an option. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mekhat. Indeed, one of the values that we do emphasize at the Global Young Leaders Dialogue is empathy. And empathy can come first and foremost with awareness. So your keynote remarks, sharing what ICRC is doing, and also the video that you shared, including other examples, can help our young leaders present today realize the actual scope of the climate challenge. And perhaps that can lead us towards understanding how young people today, in relatively privileged conditions for sure, can play a more integral role. So thank you. Now we start the panel discussion, and we are thrilled to be joined by two speakers from the ICRC. Let me firstly welcome online Head of Programs and Prevention, ICRC Ethiopia Delegation, Bruce Lorenz Biber. Policy Advisor, Policy and Humanitarian Diplomacy Division, ICRC Geneva, Amir Khozam. Energy and Climate Specialist at Client Earth, Hugh Slater. He will be joining us in the hall. Let's welcome them. Program Officer, Global Alliance of Universities on Climate, International Academic Outreach Officer, Institute of Climate Change and Sustainable Development, Tsinghua University, Lucy Tong. Welcome. Brazilian language consultant at the Esperanto section of CICG Asia Pacific Center, Rafael Henrique Zerbeto. Welcome. Can you hear me? Am I audible? Okay, great. So welcome to first both of our panelists who have joined us from online who are located. Firstly, we have Mr. Bruce Biber, who is right now in Ethiopia. He has joined us online. And I'll briefly, Mr. Bruce, you will be our first speaker today on the panel. And I'll briefly introduce that you have spent 2 years as head of the UN volunteer program in Chad before joining ICRC in 1993. And you have since then taken on various assignments with the ICRC in South Africa, Croatia, South Asia, DC, and Geneva. And you are currently the head of the program at ICRC Ethiopia. So I think my first question for you, before we loop in the panel, is that since we've mentioned that first and foremost, we would like to understand what is the impact in different parts of the world. We saw the situation in Mali and how that is affecting communities. From you, Mr. Bruce, we would like to understand what is the situation in Ethiopia right now? What is ICRC currently doing to improve the circumstances for people in Ethiopia that are suffering from climate change? And how can, lastly, if you can also mention a little bit about how can young people understand the situation in Ethiopia better and play a conducive role.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank
Can
you.
you hear?
Can you hear?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Okay.
I think there's a bit of an echo,
but
We can hear you very clearly. And let
Okay.
me add, I mean, because, I think I just threw all the questions at you. It's also, so one more thing I want to add is, of course, you're in the regional office in Ethiopia, the ground situation there, but also, we are all aware that climate injustice is a major challenge. It's something that needs to be understood. People sitting in privileged parts of the world, relatively privileged parts of the world, need to understand that we need to do much more than we can experience. So we know that Africa as a continent amidst the least and is the worst affected by climate change. So maybe if you can help us understand the situation in Ethiopia as an example, as a case, and what's the situation in the African continent? Thank you.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'll be speaking about. It's a little bit difficult because there's an echo. I can hear myself a little bit right after I say something.
We have a technical. What can we do to fix the echo? Is there anything we can do? Any suggestions?
Okay, well, I can try to go ahead. I'll have to concentrate pretty hard. Excuse me. But yes, Madam, I think I broadened the scope of my presentation to Africa in general. But I do with some aspects linked to Ethiopia and Central African Republic, where I also spent 2 years. And I also covered the Horn of Africa from Nairobi. So I'll draw a bit on my experience from all of these different contexts to reflect on the impact of climate change for people affected by armed conflicts in these different contexts. So I would first like to re-emphasize and reiterate what Thierry just said, that climate change exacerbates armed conflicts. Together they constitute a force multiplier of vulnerability. In many African contexts, the effects are far-reaching, disrupting all dimensions of people's lives, from their safety to their access to health, food, and water. Competition over diminishing resources triggers migration, displacement, and violence. Now, for instance, the effects of climate change in the Sahel and the Lake Chad region, combined with the armed conflict, has a devastating impact hundreds of kilometers away in the Central African Republic by altering the regional movement of herders and their livestock. This was what my colleague Thierry Mera was referring to in his keynote address. Changes in seasonal movements have resulted in increased violence as herders clash with farmers in areas of the country which, due to a protracted armed conflict, suffer from the absence of the rule of law. And in such lawless environments, might makes right, generating endless attacks and counterattacks in which the worst excesses are committed with complete impunity. As I mentioned, I spent 2 years working in Central Africa. We supported health structures in a part of the country particularly affected by violence between herders and farmers, including sexual violence. While I was there in 2020, we treated nearly 800 survivors of sexual violence. In other words, 2 cases per day out of a catchment population of less than 200,000. And this was just the tip of the iceberg. Chronic insecurity prevents most victims of sexual violence from accessing the health structure. The overwhelming majority of these cases were linked to clashes between the herders and farmers, which were directly attributable to the effects of climate change in conflict zones, where the rule of law has completely disappeared. Now, similar situations exist in Mali, as we saw in the film, Niger, northern Nigeria, and South Sudan. Now, in the Horn of Africa, where I am now, and I've been working in the past 2 years, it is estimated that up to 26 million people in southern and southeastern Ethiopia, northern Kenya, and Somalia are suffering from high levels of food insecurity due to the combination of armed conflict, inflation, and 5 consecutive years of drought. If we turn to Somalia, the estimated number of people affected by drought reached over 7 million by the beginning of this year, and this is nearly half of the country's population. Now, of these, over 1 million are displaced and in urgent need of food, water, and access to health care. Another million Somalis are located in areas controlled by the Islamist armed group Al-Shabaab, and therefore completely cut off from vital government services and available sources of outside assistance. Now, the negative effects of this convergence of war and climate change are also social, as families increasingly resort to negative coping mechanisms to survive. In Ethiopia, Somalia, and neighboring parts of Kenya, more and more children are dropping out of school to become child laborers, 400,000 in Ethiopia alone. Meanwhile, child marriages involving girls as young as 8 years of age are increasing at an alarming rate. Now, the dramatic situation faced by communities in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere on the continent reflects a deeper, long-term reality. And this is really tragic. The fact that climate change and protracted armed conflict are threatening the viability and the very existence of traditional livelihoods. In much of Somalia, droughts have become so frequent and severe that the chances of obtaining a good harvest from rain-fed agriculture have become extremely low. In the Horn of Africa as a whole, over 9 million livestock have died of hunger and thirst last year, severely diminishing the staple diets of milk and meat, as well as eliminating them as sources of income. In the mid to long term, this widespread decimation of herds compels the affected households to seek out alternative coping mechanisms and even livelihoods. Now, in the light of all this, what can we do to mitigate the humanitarian consequences and to help the affected communities adapt to the combined effects of armed conflict and climate change? Well, the first imperative is to gain access to the populations concerned. This is critical regarding communities who are in areas controlled or strongly influenced by non-state armed groups, where vital state services are weak or non-existent. The ICRC and its local Red Cross and Red Crescent partners are well placed to assume this crucial task by virtue of our ability to gain the confidence of the affected populations and the conflicting parties, including non-state armed groups. Now, the second imperative is to secure respect from the conflicting parties of international humanitarian law. And I hope that our young leaders of tomorrow can really carefully listen to this. Populations suffering from the combined effects of armed conflicts and climate change have the right under international humanitarian law to access food, clean water, and health services, as well as the means to provide these vital services themselves. Parties to armed conflict have the primary responsibility for ensuring that such basic needs are met. They must be influenced and made accountable accordingly. So I'm just stressing the importance of international humanitarian law, the respect of it, to ensure that people can have the are going to have the access to food and livelihoods that they're entitled to under international humanitarian law. Now, in parallel to these two imperatives, efforts must be focused on meeting the most urgent needs themselves according to context-specific approaches. Now, last year in Somalia, for example, the ICRC and the Somali Red Crescent Society provided 3 rounds of multi-purpose cash transfers to the most affected and hard-to-reach and displaced populations. I'm talking about 1 million people, thereby enabling them to make dignified choices and purchase for themselves what they urgently need. The rehabilitation of water points and the maintenance of water pumps have also been instrumental in helping hundreds of thousands of people to access safe drinking water. ICRC and the Somali Red Crescent also support and maintain primary healthcare clinics, hospitals, and stabilization centers that treat malnourished children and pregnant and lactating women. Now, emergency responses such as these fall short of what is needed to address the combined effects of climate change and armed conflicts. In the Horn of Africa, this has become a chronic situation, demanding a corresponding adaptation of livelihoods within the affected community. Now, I turn to Ethiopia, where I'm working now. 3.5 million livestock died last year in Oromia and Somali regional states alone. The ICRC has supported vaccination campaigns to over 2 million livestock and assisted 20,000 livestock keeper households to cover nutritional needs of their core breeding herds. We are also launching activities to enhance fodder production and storage in fodder banks to increase fodder availability during periods of dire need. In other words, providing the food for the livestock themselves so that they can survive during these critical periods. Another innovative initiative is to provide climate insurance coverage to enable livestock farmers to buy animals after the drought or to turn to new sources of livelihood. This too is a very innovative initiative that we as well as other actors are really beginning to engage in. Finally, the ICRC is also assisting farming communities in climate and violence-affected areas in Ethiopia, such as Oromia and Somali regional states, to produce high-quality drought-resistant seeds to meet their own needs as well as to export to the other needy areas. Now, all of these measures aim to mitigate negative humanitarian consequences and to adapt livelihoods to the emerging reality of environments that are affected simultaneously by climate change and armed conflict. These are situations which are likely to become more and more prevalent in the years ahead. All of these examples that I've been giving you, these are examples of the climate action that my colleague Thierry Merat mentioned in his keynote address. Now, as stressed by Thierry, such climate action needs to be bolstered in conflict-affected countries such as Ethiopia and Somalia, which are especially vulnerable to climate change and therefore need to benefit from climate finance. My colleague and fellow panelist Amir Kuzam will further elaborate on the climate finance aspect. But before closing, allow me to reiterate the following. Climate action and all other forms of humanitarian aid in armed conflicts is not possible without respect for international humanitarian law. Affected populations are entitled, and I repeat, are entitled to assistance and to the protection of their livelihoods. The dual role of the People's Republic of China in supporting climate action in armed conflicts and ensuring respect for international humanitarian law in Africa is absolutely critical. Not only to save lives and to alleviate human suffering, but also to open prospects for sustainable development in all of the war-torn societies of the African continent. And I would just like to close to really make an appeal to you, the members of the Global Young Leaders to mobilize support in your home countries for climate actions such as what I've described in this presentation, climate finance, and respect for international humanitarian law in countries in Africa that suffer from the dual effects of armed conflict and climate change. Thank you very much. And I'm ready if you have any additional questions for me. If you want to focus more on Ethiopia, I would be very happy. I turn it back over to you.
Really around. There's like pin drop silence in this room, you know. I wish you were here, both of you, in person as well. You know, climate change is a very hot topic, and it's an important one. But I'm sure that not a single one of us in this room, at least the ones who are not from ICRC, really can understand the kind of impact climate change has. And I mean, there's so many follow-up questions I have and others have, but I'll just give a very small example, you know. When you're mentioning, you know, the kind of challenges these communities are facing, it is unfathomable. So just a very small example is that even when the floods happened in my country, I had people who wanted to donate things that like masks, like, you know, things like that. And it was so hard for me to explain that mask is luxury, okay? They don't even have water. They don't, like, it's very, sometimes the requirements, the situation people find themselves in these extreme scenarios, what they need are things that are maybe very basic. And again, your stress on international law to recognize that this is people's right. And it is people like the ones sitting in this room. You're young, but we've all grown up. I mean, people like us have to pitch in to reduce the gap. Thank you. Thank you so much, Bruce. Next, I would like to invite Amir Kozam. Amir, thank you so much for joining us. You're policy advisor and policy and humanitarian of the Policy and Humanitarian Diplomacy Division in ICRC Geneva. Amir, can you help us understand, even Bruce mentioned that there is a big climate financing gap. And there are ways in which the knowledge and the practice of how to reduce this gap can be improved, and ICRC is proactively involved in these efforts. So can you help us sitting here understand better? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. It was great to hear from Bruce. And I think what Bruce and Thierry have both made very clear in their interventions is that the need for support in places affected by conflict, violence, and climate change is immense. It is impacting everyone's lives and every aspect of their lives. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is that need is not translating into the right level of support for the communities and the people where the ICRC works, affected by armed conflict and violence. And so what I thought I'd speak a little bit about today, and in response to your questions, is how we've been working as the ICRC to try and change that equation a little bit. I mean, in places affected by conflict and climate risk, you see this huge gap in what we would call climate adaptation work, help to help people, communities, systems adapt to the risks faced by climate change and environmental degradation. And that support requires dedicated finance. That finance is missing, and a lot of that action is missing. And that comes in large part because the institutions and the actors that do have the mandate and the expertise and the funds to implement that action often see it as difficult or too risky to operate in places affected by conflict and violence. Now, as a humanitarian organization, the ICRC, which has a mandate to protect and assist people affected by armed conflict, and is a reference organization on IHL, we are present in many of these places. And there are some things that we can do to help. And Bruce has spoken a little bit about the work that we're doing, and Thierry mentioned as well some of the commitments that we've made to ramp up the level of our climate awareness and climate smart response. But humanitarian organs like the ICRC, we're not necessarily able to operate at the scale that is required. And we also often don't necessarily have the very technical and specific expertise that's required to implement a comprehensive response to climate shocks. Action that would comprehensively address these risks is largely led by other types of actors, development actors, multilateral development banks, and by states and governments themselves. Now, This recognition of the enormous risks that are present in these settings and the needs that they continue to generate has led the ICRC to engage with those organizations quite heavily over the last few years, with the banks, with dedicated climate funds, and with governments. That's because those are the providers of climate finance and also often the recipients of climate finance in the current architecture. We've been leading a group with the World Bank over the last few years that is trying to address this challenge, and we've organized the work under the two pillars that you noted, Zun, one on climate finance and one on knowledge and practice. Maybe first on the finance piece. I can't stress this enough. There is really an inverse correlation if we look at the map between places that are most at risk of climate shocks, least ready to adapt, affected by conflict, and then the level of support that they receive. We really need to change this. And last year, we published a piece that outlined how we think some of that can be changed and how policymakers in the major providers of finance and recipient governments can look into this. And there are four kind of streams where we see some changes possible and necessary. The first is that providers of climate finance need to take a look at how they assess risk to their investment. Currently, the levels of risk analysis see that climate conflict settings and places affected by violence pose huge levels of risk to investment and to people and to action. This may, to some extent, this is true that there are risks that are specific to conflict settings, but we also think that a more holistic approach to risk, what is the risk of not acting? What is the risk of not directing resources to these settings? Sometimes is not factored into the analysis by some of these organizations. And so we've called for a more comprehensive, broader recognition of what those risks are and to make sure that risk is not being passed on to actors and communities who are living on the front lines of these crises. The second, and it's linked, is that climate finance needs to be available and provided at different scales to match the different types of action that are needed. Now, often providers of public climate finance privilege large-scale, infrastructure-heavy projects. This is because they provide quite immediate results. They also offer the prospect for returns on investment. But what we need in many places, some of the places that Bruce was speaking about, is climate finance that is accessible at the community level, at different scales, to support adaptation projects by organizations that are present on the ground, embedded with communities, and can make a real difference adapting and responding to climate risks that they see that may not necessarily be packaged into a large-scale national level project. The last two are linked. They are about collaboration and informing one another. We need to work better across sectors. What this means is that while development actors often have the finance and the ability to operate at scale, humanitarian actors offer good access, an understanding of the law, an understanding of the risks that communities affected by conflict and violence face, and familiarity with their conditions. We need to find a way to layer those strengths so that a comprehensive response is provided and is possible. And within organizations, we need to do better to break some silos around expertise. What this means is that organizations that have dedicated work streams on fragility and on conflict and dedicated work streams on climate action need to speak to one another inside organizations to make clear that conflict presents a dynamic to be reckoned with when we're looking at climate action. Likewise, in conflict settings, climate change poses risks to communities that need to be addressed. These are broad and high-level political recommendations, and they're not easy, but we think that there's some action that can be taken along those four pillars that would make a difference, would unlock the finance that is necessary to ramp up some climate action in some of the most fragile places on Earth. The second piece that we've been looking at, and it's an essential follow-up question. We've been asked often, if you were given X billion dollars today to implement climate action in some of these settings, what would you do with it? So the second question in the second pillar is, what does good practice look like in places that are affected by these compounding and converging risks? It's a good question. It requires research, and it requires us to generate the evidence that can lead to better responses by a wide slate of actors. At the ICRC, we're trying to contribute to this by doing some research into our own response and how it contributes to climate adaptation. And we're looking at some projects that we've implemented in a few different contexts, specifically in Gaza, in northern Mozambique, and in Niger. These are very different contexts with very different conditions, but what they share in common is that climate risks and conflict and violence both pose risks to the communities there, and the ICRC as a humanitarian organization is present and responding. We're looking at how we're responding in our contribution, and what we're starting to realize is one of the great strengths of a humanitarian organization like the ICRC is that we're able to test approaches and ideas. We're able to think through what it looks like to adapt to climate change at the community level in some of these settings with communities themselves. These are often quite small scale, but they're examples of how climate adaptation can be factored in, and in some cases they do have the potential to be brought up to a meaningful scale. And in order to do that, I'll return to my earlier point. We will need to work better and collaborate better with those beyond the humanitarian sector in the development and peace worlds in the space of pure climate adaptation and climate action. And we really think that this is essential, because without increasing the level of resources that go to these contexts and improving the practice that takes place there, humanitarian needs will continue to rise, crises will become more persistent. We've seen some progress. A few years ago, it was quite difficult to discuss these converging risks in multilateral settings looking at climate change, such as the UNFCCC process and the COPs. We've seen over the years a space emerge to have these discussions, and at COP28 in Dubai at the end of this year, there will be a dedicated day on relief, recovery, and peace, where discussions around these converging risks and what to do, how to address them, will be prominent and will be hosted under the auspices of the UAE's presidency. So that, we think, reflects the international community's increasing recognition that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. There remains a huge amount of work on how to do it and how to translate that recognition into concrete responses that make a difference in people's lives. And I think I look forward to this discussion, because I think the expertise you have here will help us do that. And it's critical that both we have the recognition of these risks, and also we're starting to think through what it looks like to translate that into action. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amir. A round of applause for Amir. You really helped us understand some of the causes and how the finance gaps manifest, and what are possible solutions. Especially, I think it was also very important in this kind of gathering to
point out some research areas that could use more effort, and probably it's also even more important perhaps for people sitting here to understand if they want to pursue a career addressing the climate challenge, what could be potential lines that they could look into. So thank you also for explaining ICRC's efforts. So we have 5 panelists here, and one of you is based in the African continent, one in Europe, and here we also have 3 different continents: Australia, North America, China, and Latin America, right? So firstly, let's start with you, Hugh. We first met in Hong Kong, right? And that was one of a visit, organized by organized to help people understand how China has been able to play an important role in creating more biodiverse spaces. And that's where I learned about your work. And it was interesting how your own organization is trying to understand how China, other countries can work together to reduce the gap. And we've also discussed the issue of climate injustice. So maybe you can briefly talk about, also in light of what Bruce and Amir have already shared, what you're currently working on, and how can, given the current scenario, how can we work towards focusing our attention towards resilience against climate change in communities that definitely lack the resources? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks very much, Soon. And thank you also to the organizers. It's a really good initiative. So definitely encourage more such events and more often. So yeah, I'm currently working. I'm originally from Australia, but been based in Beijing for 12 years now, working on climate policy. for a number of different NGOs and also in the consulting space as well. But right now at Client Earth, I work primarily on cooperation between the EU and China on areas of environmental policy priority between the two sides. Client Earth is, I guess, in the environmental NGO space, a relatively new one. It's sort of in the 10 to 15 years old sort of range. And it has focused so far primarily on using environmental law as a tool to get environmental outcomes. It started with that work in Europe. It's expanded that to also work in North America, East Asia. We're doing work in Japan and Philippines and other parts of the region. And then quite importantly in China from about 2017, we started working here. First of all, in building capacity for judges and prosecutors that were starting to bring cases related to environmental pollution or sort of breaching of rules and safeguards for the environment in China. And that was a very important development. And China's actually been quite forward-leaning on allowing prosecutors to bring public interest environmental cases, which is a way for essentially affected communities to have their voices heard and their cases heard and justice provided to people impacted by environmental pollution that breaks the rules. And that sort of led to a real boom in environmental cases being brought around China that are being heard and being settled and concluded, bringing a lot of, I guess, resources and justice to environmental communities in China. So it's been a really exciting area of development in China in the last few years. So environmental law is really important in our work. We also work in a few other areas in China. We've been doing quite a bit of work on supporting essentially the greening of China's overseas investments under the sort of framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's been a real priority for the last couple of years for the Chinese government to try and encourage investment in green areas in countries that are partners with under the Belt and Road. And so we've been doing work to support that. That's been very, very fruitful. We also do work on sort of greening finance. We heard a lot about the importance of channeling finance into areas like adaptation, that we need to really deal with climate change. It's a big challenge because the finance sector is enormous. East Asia is one of the major centers of the global financial industry these days. So working in this region is really important. So we do things like capacity building and training for financial regulators and industry professionals on what's the latest developments in green finance. How can you ensure that for regulators, how can you ensure that you're overseeing the financial sector in your jurisdiction well and keeping them up to date? For industry professionals, how you ensure that, for example, your portfolios are reducing their environmental risk, which is increasingly a real consideration for people in the finance sector. There's a lot of risk now with investments that are exposed to carbon risk, investments in fossil fuels and all that kind of thing. So we do a lot of work in that space as well. And then, like you said, the focus of my work is primarily cooperation between the European Union and China. And so we're doing some work across a range of areas that's identified at the ministerial dialogue level every year to help better align China and Europe on environmental regulations. So recently we've been doing work on aligning standards for motor vehicle transportation, emissions from that sector, also something on standards for green loans, also in that green finance sector, how you identify what kind of loans should be considered green. And then we do work on sort of deforestation and supply chains, biodiversity, building on the COP, the Kunming COP that was held last year. So a sort of whole range of work. I think and because we've got limited time, I'll just jump to your final question. What do we do? I mean, I guess a few takeaways. One, the previous speaker, channeling finance is critical to areas like adaptation, but on the other side of that is also the mitigation. We need to make sure that we limit climate change as much as possible, and so that means that we need to peak our emissions as soon as possible, and then reduce them as quickly as possible after that happens. At the very least, that means, I mean, and this is, I'm really not trying to make any sort of political opinion, but just based on science, it means at the very least, doing our best not to open up new fossil fuel resources for exploitation. We need to be looking at sort of plans for closing those. So, you know, just to take a couple of examples, recently we have governments in the UK sort of talking about opening up new oil and gas reserves in the North Sea, which is, I think, trending in the wrong direction. My own country, Australia, we have a much more advanced climate policy in the last 12 months with the new government, but still the government is approving new gas and extraction and even coal extraction projects. So that kind of stuff needs to stop really, really quickly. Of course, China is not exempt from this as the largest coal consumer. China's been working really hard in the last couple of iterations of its 5-year plans to have policies to sort of control its coal consumption. And I expect that there's going to be much more development of those type of policies in the coming years, because as we know, China has very ambitious emission reduction targets, and that's very encouraging, but there's going to have to be a lot of work done to achieve those. So we need to reduce our emissions. We need to make sure equity is at the heart of our climate policies. So you know, not only are the impacts of climate change felt most by the poor, the impact of the policies to reduce emissions can often also be felt most by the poor in terms of cost pass-through and stuff. So we need to make sure that we're considering how to ensure that the poorest communities are not impacted worse than others. So those are two sides of the same coin, and I guess I mean, I could say more, but I think we're running out of time.
Yeah,
so thanks.
we sort of, yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Hugh. No, there's a lot. I mean, I'll also minimize the comment I make, but really, I guess the real important question is, how do we ensure there's less injustice in the process, right? Yes, but like you mentioned, controlling emissions should be a priority. It's something that we need to encourage and find ways to, you know, ease countries into ensuring that they commit. But at the same time, communities that are the worst affected, they can't really reduce their emissions. And then that's where adaptation and working on making sure that technologies can be invested in increasing these communities' ability to protect themselves against climate change is also important. So thank you so much. Lucy Tong, formally. You are a researcher on climate change. You have worked a lot on sustainable development goals. You have also been very active in many youth organizations, including the World Economic Forum's Global Shapers, right? Can you talk about two main aspects? Firstly, what is your research and work focused on? And secondly, what is the role that youth can play right now? What can organizations like Global Shapers and GYLD do to make sure that this next generation is able to understand the challenge and bridge the gap?
Okay, can everyone hear me? So thank you, Zoom, for the question. And I would like to bring it to probably a lighter note. So I think when it comes to youth, the first thing that we have to do is to teach them and to empower them. And what could be doing when it comes to, you know, training the youth, there are a few initiatives that I like to mention. First is I have a co-curriculum course in Tsinghua that focuses on what it's you know, climate change, but I frame it in a sense that it's called dancing with international parity. So students actually come in thinking that they're going to learn about, you know, various very small talks in the international context, but in reality,
I use this opportunity to teach them about what is the international dynamic like in climate change. And by bringing them to, by teaching them, what do we mean by climate change? Do we mean by, just the natural climate changing, or do we mean human-induced climate change? It brings them a different understanding of what is climate. And then from the curriculum aspect, there are different initiatives that are available around the world, and most importantly, most recently in Tsinghua, we've launched a undergraduate program called Xiuzhong, which focuses on climate change. And this is telling, the younger generation the importance of climate change in as early as undergrad. And so they are being taught energy and climate, green economy, global governance, and so that they can be empowered to take on these roles in the future. And then on the other aspect, with Global Shapers, there are different ways that Global Shapers empower you to deal with local issues that you're facing. But one that I really particularly like is to be able to initiate the local projects, because when it comes to these international organizations, to be 100% honest, they are not sure what is going on locally. And so to give you the autonomy to be able to initiate your own projects will allow you to have, tackling a global issue, but with a local context. And so I think that empowerment aspect was, at the heart of Global Shapers. And so I think that answers your question.
Thank you, Lucy. Okay. I think so. I'm not, because we have very few minutes left. What I really want is, after Rafael, who will present a media perspective, the importance of languages and Latin America, I would like to request if Mr. Thierry and Mr. Leipili, if you have any comment as well, if you would like to, engage especially our three panelists over here. Rafael, for you, I mean, we've known each other for years as well as part of the GYLD program. And I think, we've been able to understand from Bruce, the African continent. Latin America is also, I mean, it's an important region to understand what is happening in the global South. What are young people doing in order to mobilize support for better policies and more justice when it comes to climate change challenges? So this is number one. And secondly, as a journalist, you also cover climate change, and you also focus on the importance of language in bridging gaps, in raising awareness. So can you talk a bit about these two aspects? Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for the opportunity. And well, my relation to climate change, not only climate change, but sustainable development as a whole, it started when I was younger, when I started to join TEIO, the World Esperanto Youth Organization. And I joined its Commission of External Relations. And that time, it was right before the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development in Brazil. And then I got engaged in this topic and followed up all the discussions in this topic for the coming years. And I learned a lot from that. It was a great experience. And of course, I met young activists from different organizations, from different countries, and exchanged ideas with them, especially people from indigenous communities from Brazil and also other countries. I learned a lot from them because they have a very different perspective of things. And later in 2014, I also went to Sri Lanka for the World Conference on Youth. And it was another important experience for me about the youth and this international work together for sustainable development. I can say one important lesson I got discussing with everybody, with people from so different cultural backgrounds, is that you must learn to listen first before you say something. Because people who have different points of view, they can teach you something, they can make you see the whole thing from a different angle. And this is something that we need very much right now to address world problems. So specifically about my work in TEO, our organization advocates for Esperanto as an international neutral language for international communication, but we also advocate for linguistic rights, especially the rights of linguistic minorities. We have thousands of languages in the world, and every year some languages disappear. And I remember when I was preparing for the conference in Rio de Janeiro, some months before the conference, a friend sent me an article published by a university. That article shows a correlation between language diversity and biodiversity. They got the data from different countries around the world and showed that in those countries with highest number of languages, you have also a higher level of biodiversity. And this makes us think much about what is going on, right? Because in day-by-day life, most people, they think about languages only as a tool for communication. But a language is much more than that. A language is produced by a culture, and also it produces culture. So we have this relation between language and culture that makes each community in the world unique. So it's also about the way you see the world and the way you live. So especially when we're talking about indigenous communities, you see that they have not only their own language, but also their own way to solve their problems, to use the resources they have. So each human community in the world, they developed a different way of relating with everything around them. And all those relations influenced their language. So when we lose linguistic diversity, we notice that the biodiversity also starts a process of degradation. And I could feel this very well, like when I had talks with representatives from indigenous peoples in Brazil. I could see this, that those who preserve their language and their traditions, they have a sustainable relation with the environment around them. But those who already lost their language and started to adopt little by little different lifestyle, they little by little, they start causing a different impact also on the environment. So nowadays I see that the climate change in the whole world, it's causing also many changes in the climate, in the environment you are inserted. So as a result of this, it's also changing cultures, like a traditional community living in a specific place. Now the environmental conditions there are different, or there is pollution, there are many different situations, and then they cannot live as they were living before. And then they lose also their traditions, their culture, and even their language. So this is also another dimension of how the climate change is affecting our lives.
Thank you, Rafael. Thank you so much. And before we request comments from Mr. Leipili and Tehi Mehat, I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. If anyone has a question, a comment, please raise your hand. Okay, please, you can. Please briefly introduce yourself and make a comment. It is technically almost 5:30, but if I can request everyone, if we can finish maybe end by 5:40, if we have Mr. Thierry's approval. Is it okay if we end maybe 10 minutes later? Yes? Okay, please, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. My name is Alliance. I'm from Norway. So I am a Schwarzman scholar and the leader of Beijing to Hub for the Global Shapers, the World Economic Forum. And I now work at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, also known as AIIB. I thank you so much for the panel today. I think it was a very, very fruitful discussion with loads of topics and extremely interesting conversation on climate change. From what I took is that there is a great problem in the world today regarding our global commons and the challenges that we face in protecting and managing the global commons for unprecedented issues and the different interests between private and public sector. So my question goes like this, and it's particularly for the ICRC and the client Earth. So in the tug of war between economic
growth and conservation of the environment, in countries, for example, like Ethiopia, which has been clearly stated has experienced severe consequences of both civic conflict and climate change, but it's also one of the most fast-growing countries in Africa and with one of the greatest populations. So what should we do when it comes to then the financing, when governments are requesting financing, particularly for development, but there's also a great need for financing for climate change or for environmental conservation? And then the second part of that question is, what should the youth do? Because the youth growing up in these economies would greatly benefit of economic growth, but also would be severely hurt by climate change. So thank you so much. That's my two questions.
Thank you, Alliance. Maybe we can take another question or two. Okay, please, you can introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Enoch from Hong Kong, China. I'm also a Schwarzman scholar as well. I'm currently working for CGTN. My question is, in 2 days, in August 15, is going to be China's first National Ecology Day. Ecology and ecological civilization and climate change has very close connection. So I wonder, what can we expect of China's first National Ecology Day? And what can youth play in promoting better ecological civilization, in promoting climate change in return as well, and leapfrogging and accelerating the progress of climate action?
Thank you, Enoch. Any more questions
or comments? Yes, we have another question next to Enoch.
Hi, this is Tei Chia from Japan, and also I'm from Tsinghua. And my question is, I have been participating in some of the model climate change conference held at the Tsinghua last year, maybe this year too. And but during the model conference, what we talk about is all the mitigation and adaptation, and possibly there's some compensation. And then there's nothing about the tangible kind of the help for these Ethiopian or East Horn Africa people. And then shouldn't there be some discussion that, okay, the framework is good, but there is some the pressing priority there. So let's talk about the more tangible the actions about these countries, and then maybe the assigning some country by country to taking some actions, pairing with say US and Ethiopia or Japan and Somalia, or whatever it is. More sort of I don't see the very kind of the tangible actions coming out of this conference. Would you share that idea? And then is there anything we can do?
That's such an, because I completely, the fact that, there is a specific number of people starving right now because of climate change. What can we do to reduce their suffering, et cetera, et cetera. So I think definitely we can try and see how our panelists would like to respond to that question as well. Any other questions? We have two more. Wow. Are the panelists, you have to keep track of the questions. You can't? Do you want a pencil? Okay, I have the questions. Okay, Lucy is taking, okay, two more, please.
Okay, thank you. My name is Lawrence, and I'm a graduate student at Tsinghua University. I would like to ask, I think Mr. Bruce, I think you give an important insight about Ethiopia with, in regards to climate change and conflict, how it affects any solution that can help people. So I am an engineering student at Tsinghua University, and I'm looking for a way to contribute. But seems like leaders in Africa might ignore most of the ideas from young, talented engineers or maybe diasporas to help with even solving climate change or maybe some of the solution for basic needs for people. What can young engineers like me or any other diaspora do to contribute to such issues in regard to climate change? Thank you.
Thank you. And Lawrence, this question is specifically for Bruce? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. And we had another hand flying. Yes, please. Oh, the mic needs to go to the back row. Who has the mic? Maybe one of our staff can come and help you with that. Yeah. So 4 questions so far, one specifically for Bruce, and maybe the rest we can see. If you would like to respond, you can volunteer to.
Hello, I am Xiaoya Li from Zhejiang University. Now I'm the intern at Food and Agriculture Organization at the United Nations. And now I have a question because as the young generation, I really want to know how can we be involved in this process and what kind of climate related job we can do after our graduation. Because now I have been involved with the program launched by Tsinghua University, like a climate leadership program, but it's more about education and give more knowledge. But I still don't know how to do after my graduation. And thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think that could also tie in very well with what Amir was talking about, right? Amir Kazan, you talked about research gaps. Anyone else? This is our last chance. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, good. So the first question, maybe the Climate Finance Gap Alliance mentioned. Would you like to contribute to that? Okay.
It was, yeah, I think it was
It's for
so this question about economic growth and mentioned climate, that's right. I'll quickly just talk to it. I mean, I think it really depends what you mean by economic growth. And that's questions that I think politicians, government representatives need to be thinking about today, right? Like too often discussion stops at, well, we created 5-6% growth this year. That's great short-term growth, but what does it mean for the long-term economy of a developing country? Does that growth come as a real value add that's creating an ongoing source of value for the economy, or is it an extractive type value that is gone as soon as you use it, and then has some ongoing costs that the economy has to pay for down the line? So you need to, we all need to be thinking, and especially government representatives need to be answering much more in-depth questions than simply, are we creating economic growth? Are we creating value for our society over a longer period? In terms of youth role, I think that's really important, because it's not just the economic growth, but it's that the sustainability of the economic growth that will be of most value to them.
Okay, thank you. We had a second question by Enoch on National Ecology Day of China. Who has a response, or what would you expect from that? Maybe would Lucia, Rafael, would you like to just comment on that? Maybe. Okay, we'll wait for someone else to comment on that. Sure. Any other questions?
Yes. Just one comment on the Ecology Day. I wouldn't speak to the specific day, but one thing I would maybe note, and our colleagues who look at the intersection between conflict and
have noted that the majority of conflicts take place in what we call biodiversity hotspots. And often conflict and violence can contribute to a negative feedback loop that further degrades the environment, further damages ecosystems, which
in in a continuingly negative feedback cycle, reduce the natural resources that people can rely on to adapt to longer term trends in conflict change. So what I would look for in a lot of these forums, and what the ICRC is trying to do with our partners, is to note the gaps when we're looking at the protection of important ecosystems and biodiversity. What are the gaps? What are the areas that are not protected? What are the areas that are at particular risk? Where do the complex risks mean that perhaps the focus shifts elsewhere? And by this, I mean complex risks that involve, difficult topics like conflict and violence, and how that impacts the environment, and how those items might be protected under various bodies of international law. So one thing I would say is maybe to just look at where the gaps are in focus, and see if there's a possibility to shine a bit of a light on some of them to increase attention and then ultimately increase action.
Thank you, Amir. That's very helpful. And there were a few other questions as well. I mean, if you would like to right now take a go at
some of the questions that were raised, you can. For example, one was about very tangible help, how to bring tangible help to people. I mean, this is a very precise, if you would like to respond to that. Also research, what kind of research should people be doing? I mean, there were a couple others, so just see which ones would you like to respond.
Sure, yeah. A question around tangible support to people in need. I think it's important to, and can speak to this in detail, but it's important to make sure that we're not saying that all humanitarian needs or all development needs
are directly about climate change. What we're saying is, in many places where people do have need, climate generates new risks. And some of the responses will require us to address climate shocks and deal in the realm of climate adaptation, climate mitigation. Some of them will require support to other forms of humanitarian action, humanitarian assistance, development, and longer term interventions to increase people's access to markets, access to resources and services. So what tangible things, for example, in Ethiopia, some of those require supporting local governments, local actors, humanitarian organizations, and the development system to make interventions. Some of them will mean that we need to take a look at these problems from a lens that incorporates climate shock. So I just want that's one distinction that I think is important. And not every instance of food insecurity is only about climate. It's about a complex and interlocking set of factors. And so the responses that provide direct support to people also need to be supported, even as we ramp up our response to the longer term changes in climate and what those mean in the future. And then finally, I think it's a linked question from our colleague at FAO on what it means, what you can do. I mean, I think that someone put it very well. Climate change is not a sub-theme. It's not a pillar. It's the world in which we operate, and it's about how we are people in the future, right? So in every field, in agriculture, in development, in infrastructure design, in architecture, we'll have to be thinking more and more about what that means. We're going to live in a world that is not like this one. The past is no longer a good guide to the future, as one climate scientist puts it. So incorporating an expertise in climate change and climate shocks into any field will be critical. And from our perspective, we think it's important that as you do that, as the leaders in this room do that, they ensure that some of the most vulnerable and most marginalized communities, including those who are affected by conflict and violence, are not excluded from those efforts and those innovations.
Thank you, Amir. They're not excluded from those conversations and those efforts. Thank you. Let's, Bruce, please. Over to you. There were so many questions, and I'm sure your insights, your input will be extremely valuable as well.
No, thank you very much. And I think my colleague Amir said a lot of the things that from the ICRC perspective, but what I can add is, what is particularly dramatic, I would say, in southern Ethiopia and Somalia and different parts of Kenya and things, is that it's really climate change has really created a chronic problem of drought. Drought used to be a one-off situation. There would be a very severe drought every 10, 20 years, but now it's really become every year practically. And this has had the impact on people's livelihoods. And I'd like to make the link with the cultural perspective and linguistic perspective of one of the panelists. I mean, it's now climate change, of course, it's really, people suffer from, from being denied basic services and access to food and water. But it is also profoundly a threat to people's way of life, and I think this is what we really see in this part of the world. It's a threat to the way of lives of herders and also of farmers as well, and that's how it's really changed the ICRC's and other humanitarian actors' approach of how can we be useful in this kind of situation when it's actual livelihoods now that are being threatened durably. And so I think this is where I link it up with the young engineer who asked the question. I mean, we need innovative solutions. We need your type of expertise to help these societies adapt, but in ways that that are compatible with their ways of life, with their cultures. A huge challenge, huh? I mean, because it's actually their own livelihoods that are really a risk of being irrelevant or in yeah, or not adapted to the situation. So that's would be my appeal to young people, is to indeed join the need to provide innovative solutions to help preserve and help people affected to adapt their livelihoods to the new situation.
Thank you. Usually, as the because I'm moderating, I'll be the one limiting the time. But I do have a question, a very quick one for Bruce or Amir. When you see, I mean, what you're experiencing, right? The kind of situations you're coming across when the convergence between, climate change and conflict, and you really see that manifestation, that impact climate change has. And it's the worst possible manifestation that most of us sitting here have never even imagined or fathomed. What works? I mean, we need empathy, right? Even if people want, they cannot possibly understand what it might take. What is working when it comes to mobilizing support? That means mobilizing people support, awareness. What is working in terms of increasing the level of empathy and willingness in privileged parts of the world or less affected parts of the world for those that are worst affected? If anyone of you would like to.
Yeah, I can say just it's testimonies are really important. Of course, that people around the world are connected with the realities of what populations are suffering concretely from the dual effects of armed conflict and climate change. And I would say that the importance there is really also to make the link between people's rights. People have the right to be supported. They're entitled to assistance. They're entitled to the protection of their livelihood. I'm speaking of people in armed conflict. Livelihoods are protected under international humanitarian law. And to combine this and to accompany it by climate action, it's really two birds with one stone. It's enabling people to adapt to the situation, and indeed also to pursue their ways of livelihood faced with the challenge of the dual challenge of armed conflict and climate change. And I would just like to finish there. When you're respecting IHL, you're also establishing the conditions for peace. It's really generating that kind of humanity in the most extreme circumstances that makes peace possible. So again, I think a dual approach of climate action and respect for IHL not only meets the needs and helps preserve the livelihoods and way of life of people, but also allows for the possibility of peace and sustainable development ultimately.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Amir, Anyone, would you like to add anything to these points, or let's invite? Okay. Thank you so much to all the panelists. Let's give them a warm round of applause. I know this topic, everybody is so serious now, nobody wants to clap, but that's important. Okay, Mr. Tehi Mekhat, if I may invite you. Any comments you'd like? We need the mic to be with Mr. Tehi. Yes.
No, thank you very much. And I think there is, we wanted to draw the attention to this dimension that climate change has as well an impact on conflict and on a number of populations. And the experience of the ICRC is very concrete. So that's why it is important to bring our knowledge here as well in China to let people know exactly what is taking place over there, and to see that the situation of people there deserves assistance, deserves protection, and it is an issue that is not only ours, but it is an issue of all of us. And I think in the overall problematic, there is one word which is so important, it's together. We have to act together. And it's true, and the panelists here have diverse approach, which are all complementaries to the goal, which is to face climate change and to find mitigation responses, I mean, at every level. We bring something different. We bring the reality of people who are in dire need and who will be in more dire needs in the future. And I think it is very important to have that in mind. And I think for us, obviously, we will be always on their side because that's our mandate, but it is as well a humanitarian imperative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tehi. And if Mr. Lei Pili would like to make any remark, any encouragement, anything you can say that can further encourage our young leaders to push further for unity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think we do have a very good discussion this afternoon, and I do learn a lot from the views. And what impressed me most is the finance gap. Finance gap. Finance gap. I think now in the international cooperation area, we are not lack of good projects, but we lack of finance. If you remember that I mentioned the Global Development Project pool, we have set up recently. Let it will be a platform to narrow the gap, we are trying to. I think it will be a platform to match the need and the finance. And we will do our best to narrow the gap. Okay, I think that is what I.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. A warm round of applause for Sitka, for ICRC, our hosts, co-hosts, and our panelists, and everyone who raised a question. No more, I know a few hands are being raised. You can find a moment to discuss with our keynote speakers or panelists if you have any more questions. And any final words, maybe if Ms. Mabel, would you like to make any final, just brief, any comment as the founder of GYLD? The mic is with, I think, Mr. Paley, Mr. Lei Pili, yeah. Yes, just 2 minutes. And then we'll conclude the panel. I know we're 10 minutes up. Yes.
Okay, thank you, all of you. Actually, it's a very vivid and wonderful occasion for young people worldwide today. And I'm so proud of our GYLD program. And thank you very much. This panel, I think with the strong dynamics, with the young voices, of course, have professional voice from senior voices. We combine those voices. It's a force for global governance and climate change and resilience. We know actually the world is so uncertain. We need to the voice and the force work together, be together to address those global challenges. We talk about climate change every day. Everybody believes that is a very important issue. But right now we need the action and the pragmatic policy guide and action So I think future belongs to the young people. Young people have a very strong force and motivation to push forward the climate change issues addressed. But due to the geopolitical tensions and other uncertainties, the world is not unpeaceful, and we have the pragmatic acting. So I should thank ICRC this time very much. Thanks, Mr. Mayor, for your kind leadership and for ICRC's cooperation and partnership. I think ICRC, we have to meet those results and outcome of the people's a kind of a disability on climate change. But ICRC for humanity, it's can address the results, have to meet the result. That's why we would like to cooperate with the ICRC to address this global challenge. I have no other words. I just want to appreciate this kind of occasion and so part of our young people's voice and GYLD's missions make the young voice heard globally. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Once more for everybody, for all our panelists, let's wrap it up. And with this, I mean, it's really just as you concluded, Mabel. We hope to be able to create or be part of more spaces where young leaders and professionals can cooperate and work together. So thank you. With that, we conclude the GYLD Annual Forum 2023. And we hope that the dialogue definitely it will continue. So thank you.